Abraham Lincoln famously said that the war between the states was the Lord's judgment against both the North and the South. Elsewhere, Lincoln said that the North and the South were equally at fault for the institution of slavery. He didn't say those things only to sound noble. He was stating the cold, hard facts. Unfortunately, the writing of today's history books is so distorted that they offer no evidence to support that view. Unless we have a clear understanding of history, we will fail to recognize the lessons of history when they stare us in the face. There are 4 ways that the writing of history distort history. Lying outright, in which case history becomes little more than a set of lies agreed upon. Cherry-picking, selecting only the facts that support prearranged conclusions. Deliberately misusing words to defend the indefensible, and employing double standards, in this case, judging Southerners by the standards of today while excusing Northerners by an elastic use of standards as they might have been more than 150 years ago. How did the slaves get to America? Slavery existed in Africa for thousands of years. When one tribe would attack another tribe's village, they frequently took slaves for themselves. In the 15th century, long before Columbus, Portuguese traders bought African slaves and imported them into Europe. Other Europeans followed suit. The African slave trade could not have been possible without the active cooperation of Africa's tribesmen and Africa's ruling elite. They paid for the slaves with cowries, a kind of seashell that was commonly used for money and jewelry. European slavery. After Europe began colonizing the Americas, labor shortages were met by transporting slaves to the Western Hemisphere. From the 16th century onward, some 12.8 million African slaves were transported to the New World, mostly to Brazil and the Caribbean. Around 380,000 were transported to England's American colonies, including present-day Canada. The first slave ships to come to America were English and Dutch. When the Americans began outfitting slave ships, there were New England slave ships. Because southern colonies were primarily agrarian, the New England colonies, that is, Northerners, dominated the American slave trade. The first slaves were captured near African coasts. As the demand for more and more slaves grew, slave traders moved farther and farther inland for slaves. From there, the Northerners force-marched them to the coast. Several times as many Africans died on the way to the slave ships as onto the slave ships themselves. The Africans were closely packed on the slave ships in small spaces, living in their own filth. Many of them died of disease. Many others committed suicide. For the entertainment of the ship's crews, Africans were forced to dance. If they weren't lively enough with their dances, they were whipped. For the comfort of the crews, sailors aboard the northern slave ships were given free rein to treat the African women as they wished. For that reason, slave ships were known in the trade as a bachelor's paradise. When a slave ship reached halfway between Africa and the New World, the captain and his officers sorted through the Africans to separate the healthy ones from the unhealthy ones. The unhealthy Africans would not be marketable, and the slavers did not want to be stuck with him. The crews of the northern slave ships gathered the unhealthy Africans on deck, chained them together, and weighed them down with rocks. Then they pushed them overboard to drown. After the slave ships arrived at their home ports in the northern colonies, the slaves were sold where they were, or they were shipped elsewhere. In 1808, England outlawed the slave trade. That same year, the United States Constitution forbade the importation of slaves into the United States, but it still allowed American ships to engage in the slave trade as long as they didn't enter U.S. waters. Over the next few decades, several other European nations outlawed the slave trade. European slavers took advantage of this loophole in the American law by keeping an American and an American flag aboard their slave ships. This American was called the keeper of the flag. If any of the authorities approached their slave ships, they would quickly sell the ship to the American, run up the American flag, making it therefore illegal for them to have slaves on board the ship. Once the authorities were out of sight, the sale would be reversed to their original owners. The Southern flag never flew over a slave ship. Never, ever. But for several decades, the American flag protected the European slave trade long after it was outlawed in Europe.